broken down railways, dysfunctional airlines, corrupt energy utilities, where people don't receive necessary services to achieve a quality of life. We'd say it is strategic for these developing countries to allow for these industries to be privatized. What we mean by privatization is quite basic, that the ownership of these utilities will belong to shareholders or other forms of decision makers in companies such as board of directors, and governments themselves will have no opportunity to make any sort of decision that affects the running of these utilities and the way in which they produce, procure, and give services to people. We don't think that this precludes governments from cross-subsidizing these services or paying for these services on behalf of their citizens. We think privatization in today's debate focuses primarily on ownership. Although we don't have an explicit burden to provide any sort of policy, being that this is a this House believes situation, we think there is obviously a certain way in which privatization would occur. We think it will most likely be gradual, whereby ownership would firstly be transferred. In other words, private interests would be allowed to make decisions. However, governments would obviously still continue to cross-subsidize the overhead costs of some of these utilities that require infrastructure development. For instance, obviously these private companies will have to collaborate with the government in order to create this infrastructure, and these private sector companies will have to take the entire overhead cost upon themselves. But there will be eventual full ownership of these companies, whereby these companies will be fully responsible for how they cover and pay for things such as their operational costs, which are likely to come from reinvestments from whatever money they do earn. We do also say that it would be practical and it would make sense the government would still be able to be an investor within these private companies through things such as government bonds and pension funds, which is already status quo, whereby governments do invest into private shareholder companies. And then, most importantly, government can still pay for services on people's behalf. So that will mitigate the effects of the potential inability for certain people to afford to pay for the private service, would allow governments to pay on their behalf in that instance. Most importantly, we think that it's less likely to be a condition of monopolies, whereby one industry is able to monopolize, a utility such as energy or transportation within a developing country. We think it is more likely that multiple different private companies will play a role in providing services to people, in opposed to a monopoly. So what's the problem in today's debates that we're trying to avoid? We have seen a situation where developing countries have been particularly unable to provide services to their people because of the interest that these developing countries have that tend toward corrupt activities. Why do these people have these interests? Two reasons. There's an interest for developing countries to empower particular individuals that are able to keep them in power. So this means they're more likely to incentivize or help people who have, industries that might produce coal, for instance, if it is a coal-producing country, and consistently award them the ability to provide coal for their energy utility because those business people contribute to their campaigns or do certain financial contributions that give them power. Secondly, we say that there's very low accountability, for instance, where governments do fail to provide services to people. This is because many people are hesitant to vote out certain political parties that they're attached to, simply because they haven't provided certain services. We've also seen that other ways to hold states accountable, for instance, service delivery protests, have been really ineffective because of state power, such as police. So in this instance, a lack of accountability means that states don't necessarily improve their services. But most important, the efficiency of the service is not important for governments. Unlike private companies that have to get profit or improve the efficiency of their services in order for them to continue to win in a competition with other private companies, states have a monopoly over that service, so they have no interest to improve it or to make it good, in order for them to maintain control over it. So the interest that they have caused the deterioration of these services, as we've seen in instances where there are railways that don't function adequately or are dangerous, or energy utilities that are inefficient and cause blackouts within developing nations. So we think that this inefficiency also is directly related to government corruption. Moreover, we think governments are hesitant to try and fix this corruption problem. They're hesitant to cancel certain processes, bids, or tenders that they have given to really corrupt businesses because of the connection that they have with those businesses in today's debate. So this also creates the additional harm where it escalates the cost of operating these services. If you are an energy utility and you're getting inefficient coal because the company producing that coal has no interest to make it efficient, or you're escalating costs to operate your airline, it's more likely that it's going to increase the cost of operating that utility. These can be paid for either by increasing the cost of that utility and making, airplane tickets more expensive, no thank you, or increasing the price of things such as electricity, or you're going to have to try and find a way to bail out those essential industries through things such as government guarantees and the consistent pumping of government revenue into propping up these services. That means that when the operations of these costs are higher, it directly impacts people because people either directly pay for that service more or pay for it more through taxes. We also think it is much more likely that an inefficient service whereby whereby you are, using inefficient means to provide the service is likely to be more expensive in the status quo than when a private company takes over. That's potential the harm we want to fix. So what does our world look like where private sector takes over? Firstly, the private sector has interests to be efficient because they are competing with other private sector companies that are likely to be able to provide that efficiency. It also means that they have an interest to price these services fairly, because if they price the service unfairly, they're unlikely to get the opportunity to take over that utility, in competition with companies that will price it fairly. So we don't think a major harm in today's debate is they're going to unfairly price essential utilities. They also have interest to make good decisions in order to advance that efficiency goal, but also because it's easier to hold these companies accountable. Their shareholders are likely to disinvest if they make bad decisions, and the public can specifically target these companies if they make bad decisions. Any POI?
Yeah, sure. So all of your current argumentation is kind of hinged on the idea that government's stuck at running utilities. What about the governments that are actually good at it?
We think on the comparative, we've seen a lot of instances where developing countries have been unable to run this efficiently. But secondly, my argument hinges on the interests that government have and why those interests don't align with the provision of services that are likely to be cheaper and are likely to not tend toward corruption. It is the interest that government have that you need to respond to in this debate, because that's what we've hinged our case on, compared to the interest that private sector has towards greater accountability and greater efficiency of the service. Even if you're running it efficiently, people still cannot hold you accountable, and you still hold a monopoly over that service. We support a world where you are at least able to hold those corporations accountable when they put lead in your water, for instance. We think that that's particularly important. We also think there's more likely to be greater innovation and improvement of these services, because there is an interest to continually improve the way in which you transport people within your country, such that you can compete with other companies that are consistently innovating. You're more likely to implement green technologies and do progressive things with the utilities when you are competing in in comparison to a world where you monopolize. You're also able to focus and specialize in improving that service. You're able to create R&D networks within your company to specifically improve the efficiency of that. In the end, our world looks like a world where people get services, where people have more power to hold their energy and other utility suppliers accountable, and a world where we take developing countries out of their dustbins.
We thank the Prime Minister for their speech and now invite the leading opposition.
Members of the House, as side opening opposition today, we believe that it's not a good idea to try to solve a bad situation by adding more bad people to it. Right? Yeah. We ultimately believe that we are willing to accept a system in which there is slightly more ineffective service delivery than a system in which service delivery becomes monopolized by private companies which are only incentivized by for-profit motives. Right. Now, most of my argumentation clashes very nicely with what the government has brought us, so I think my rebuttal will be mostly interspersed. But one thing before I begin, most of our propositions that we will be bringing in, and most of the harms that they've already kind of preliminarily identified, they immediately try to mitigate by proposing government intervention again. Governments will restrict these companies, governments will subsidize these companies where it's not profitable, these kinds of things. Please note that that's not a good line of argumentation for them to take, because they've already characterized these governments as being corrupt and inefficient. So then, when in these situations, for example in subsidies, where we're talking about the poorest of the poor, they once again automatically have to rely on the government to subsidize and step in. Those are those same governments that they say are too corrupt to do the job in the first place. So ultimately, we see that this simply isn't going to work. That line of reasoning isn't going to work for them to try to mitigate this. They have to try to go full on to explain to us why allowing these large-scale capital companies is going to be better without any government regulation or intervention. Right. So coming to some characterization about these companies, because I felt that open government's characterization of these companies and how they function in providing these services was somewhat disingenuous. Firstly, we must note that these companies are usually large and powerful conglomerates that that have the ability and the capital to build this kind of infrastructure. Because remember, these things become enterprises usually in the first place because they cannot be companies, because companies cannot immediately take that place. We don't have, a perfume enterprise because perfume is automatically accessible to markets. Therefore, we have enterprise in situations which don't appear to be that profitable. In other words, you need a lot of capital to get things going there. For example, in terms of, say, the electrical infrastructure or pipes or water supply and something like that, the amount of capital required to even start entering that market is massive and only accessible to very select number of conglomerates, and this is very important, right? This means that this competitiveness that they're talking about, this so-called free market that will drive down prices, is simply not the case. We don't see that anywhere because you cannot have 17 water suppliers in the same city that compete over the same set of pipes or something like that without some weird kind of government regulation which goes against what they want anyway. No. And meaning that ultimately, as a consumer, your only choice will be to invest in or to use the company that is actually invested in building the infrastructure in your area. You're going to be trapped. And also, these companies know that. They're not going to go and invest into a place where there are other companies. And if you're talking about the government is going to have to reinforce or enforce, break up monopolies, once again, we're talking about governments that are generally characterized as being weak and corrupt. So once again, they won't be able to do this, especially when we're talking about these capitalistic conglomerates, because they can exploit that, poor lack of power and corruption even more than the government itself can, because they will ultimately never be as beholden to the people as the government itself, right? So we're going to see monopolies. We can even see oligarchies where these companies come together and say, okay, you'll take this province and you build your telephone lines there, we'll take this one. And that's how it works. That's what we're seeing in America to a large extent with Verizon and water companies and rail companies and so forth, right? And so this is the context in which we have to have this debate. Now, the three main arguments that I'm going to bring you as opening opposition is that firstly, we cannot protect the poorest of the poor in these situations. Because in some of the situations in these developing countries, things like water and electricity are not going to be profitable. The infrastructure you're going to require to invest into an area to provide these basic and essential services to these people won't be profitable, so these companies will have no incentive to enter into that. And if then, as opening OG said, the government will subsidize these things, that doesn't work because, as I said, we're working in a corrupt government. We see this in South Africa, for example, in what's called tender entrepreneurship, where private companies take these things because how this works, the government says, okay, we need to have this service done by a private company willing to pay you this much. And what we see is that it goes to, that contract then goes to some corrupt official second cousin, and at the end of the day, it just doesn't happen. This is much more reality when we see people sitting without water because our water services are failing, right? Closing. Anything?
Developing nations have a large amount of capital flowing in from foreign markets as a result of new opportunities in those areas. Why is there a lack of opportunity to actually have a private business that has enough money to create an actual enterprise such as you're discussing?
I think that's simply disingenuous. Developing countries, per definition, don't have large amounts of capital flowing into the country. And even if that capital is flowing in, that's people buying up the infrastructure in the country, giving people less control. And in the long run, that doesn't solve the problem, right? In fact, it's going to open up these avenues of exploitation, right? Further, the other problem that we see is this is going to restrict the suffering to the poor. Because the rich people or middle-class people or more affluent people, they'll have their services covered because they can pay for these things. They can pay for water, for electricity, they'll be fine. And the poor will be confined to wherever they are without power, without water, these kinds of things, right? And what we see then is we're going to have a less democratic situation in which the suffering is ever more restricted to the poor, and powerful lobbying groups, the rich and so forth, will be less affected by bad things, so they will have less incentive to use their power for the ultimate benefit of the people in the country, creating a greater disparity in quality of life between the rich and poor, we think is a bad thing at the end of the day. And finally, it's going to undermine even those who can pay, because remember, these companies are for-profit companies. So they're going to not ask us, what is the minimum amount of money that we need to provide these services to the people? They're going to be, what's the most amount of money we can get out of these people? And given the problematic market circumstances within which these markets will happen, we'll see that ultimately this is going to push up prices even for people who can afford it. Businesses are going to pay more for electricity and water, and there's going to be no overflow of things being cheaper, no trickle-down effect, nothing like that. And so ultimately, what we see from South government isn't going to help the system at all. They're taking a weak government and placing it before wolves, of international conglomerates, and that's only going to make the situation worse. We believe that, thumbs up.
Madam Speaker, at the moment, state-owned entities are ridden with massive amounts of debt that they are shouldering off onto the poor anyway. The poor aren't getting services from their governments. The reality that opposition need to deal with is that there isn't any efficiency, there aren't any services, and there aren't any effective utility companies to provide these services in the first place. We think these sorts of governments need a solution, and that solution is privatization. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is why we think we significantly enhance government obligation under our side of the house and make it easier for government to provide services to their people. The second thing is I'm going to talk about the harmful nature of debt that currently exists and makes these state-owned entities extremely problematic. And lastly, I'll talk about the competitive nature that we add to state-owned entities. Let's first respond to their point on why it will become more expensive. I think we already have a really good preemptive response to this when we say states already subsidize services for the poor. So if these companies are going to charge these individuals so excessively that they can't afford these things, states already have a solution to this. Why is this the case? Because the state's obligation to provide access to these individuals does not go away. That's why they would have the option or an incentive to provide these services in the first place. But secondly, we think we can differentially charge people based on their consumption. It is often not the poor and the marginalized that are consuming the most amount of these utilities in the first place. It is businesses and corporations and the middle class. We think developing countries are already charging those individuals more. So if they think that this cost is going to be something that is problematic in the status quo, we think those costs can be shouldered off to those individuals that can actually afford it under our side of the house. The second thing is, if they increase costs, this is actively harmful to their businesses to begin with. Why? Because they're excluding the majority of people that are going to use their service in the first place. They won't be getting revenue from those individuals. It is not profitable to be charging those individuals that can't be affording it because they just won't buy those services in the first place. But secondly, we already have governments that have placed certain regulations on these companies to stop them from raising their prices to such a great extent. This happens in the US. Although, yes, it isn't a developing country, they stopped telecommunication companies from raising their prices to an unacceptable rate. But also, in some instances, the competition is so good that those companies want to compete for people's interests, compete to ensure that they can provide the best services to those individuals in the first place. Let's respond to their idea on monopolies. They say the only individuals that can enter these markets are large conglomerates. This is absolutely false. Why is this the case? Because the infrastructure in developing nations largely already exists. These countries do have planes, they do have pipelines, they do have railways. What they don't have is effective and efficient management and administration of these services. They do, for example, South Africa does have a bunch of planes through South African Airways, but it doesn't use it effectively to ensure that it becomes an efficient business. Secondly, we think under our side of the house, our model, we say we would replace these companies and we would ensure that these companies can actually ensure efficiency in the long run. We don't think that these companies will remain in place forever, right? Because those shareholders have the ability to ensure that they place accountability on them, but also also, tender processes generally work on a 10-year basis, up to which governments can replace these companies in the first place. I don't know why they would form monopolies. Let's first talk about no, thank you. Let's firstly talk about why we think this enhances government obligation. And the context that you currently need to take into place is that there isn't services that reach these people. The majority of people in South Africa have to experience blackouts on a daily basis because the utility company Eskom cannot provide electricity to those areas. Individuals cannot afford airline tickets because it is way too expensive, and the debt burden is shouldered off onto the poor. The government spends more on bailouts currently to those companies and state-owned entities than they do on health and education, for example, in South Africa. So that's the context that they must deal with under our side. Why would these companies be more efficient, and why does this enhance government obligation? Firstly, because these companies have to annually and quarterly report to their shareholders. One of those shareholders is the government, who fundamentally has the interests of the people at heart. We don't think that those harmful practices that they talk about go unnoticed. But secondly, you need to note that these companies have massive amounts of expertise already included in them that governments don't. They have massive recruitment programs at universities at which they get the best people to run their companies. Generally, companies are more attractive to work for, and corporations are more attractive to work for than governments. So individuals who are talented migrate to those companies in the first place. If they can provide a more efficient service, then governments can better fulfill their obligation to provide services to the people. And that's the most important impact in today's debate, the efficiency and the way in which you provide services to your people. Closing.
So would you force countries like China to privatize their highly effective and environmentally friendly national power utility?
First of all, the Chinese power utility has severe private elements to it, up to the point at which they get private individuals in to actually run those companies in the first place. The second thing is developing countries like the UAE and Qatar get private individuals in to run their services, and they also outsource private companies to handle certain services in their companies, i.e. the major 3 airlines within the Middle East, Emirates, the UAE, and Qatar Airways. Those corporations are very, very privatized, even though they do get funding from the government. That's something that they don't deal with under their side. Firstly, what is the problem with them at the moment? Massive amounts of debt that they currently have. This burden is often shouldered off onto people, to the point at which if these companies, state-owned companies, want to pay off their debt, they raise the prices so that individuals bear the cost of those debts in the first place. Why is this so incredibly harmful, and why is this harm a great impact in today's debate? Because these state-owned entities are generally tied to how attractive investment seems in those nations. If these companies are severely inefficient and can't actually provide any services, private corporations and foreign direct investors don't see this country as a profitable thing to actually invest into in future, which means other corporations suffer as a result. Other government programs suffer as a result because of the lack of efficiency in state-owned entities. One thing you cannot miss in today's debate is that there are more governments in the developing world that are absolutely shit at providing these services than there are good ones, and that's the context that we must deal with. Thank you.
Hello. Opening government can't make their cake and eat it, right? So let's see what we get from Francois. First statement, well, the states are shouldering a lot of debt to the poor. Second statement, the state is already subsidizing for the poor in the status quo. And if this subsidy is something to talk about in this debate, then it's a significant subsidy. So we don't know if the state is shouldering debt to the poor or if it's significantly subsidizing this poor, right? You can't have it both ways. But second statement, the state is very corrupt in managing these institutions. And then he goes on to say, well, private companies are beholden to shareholders, of which the state is a shareholder, and the state has the interests of people at heart. So what is it? Can the state not manage and be able to control a private company, or the state can manage, and either way we still let the state manage private entities? We think there's a lot of clashes within their own case that discredits their own case entirely, but I'll be showing that deeper in my independent rebuttal, right? But first of all, here's a piece of context that opening government doesn't want to give you, but I'll give you for free, right? So first of all, the kind of countries that we're talking about are developing countries. A significant characteristic of developing countries is that there is two classes. It's either you have very poor people and then you have super, super rich people. So what, a second kind of characteristic that will give specifically from opening opposition is that the entities that we're talking about, much of them are the entities that provide things like basic rights, things that allow you to live a meaningful life. We're talking about the provision of water, the provision of electricity, things like housing, right? So these are the things that people depend on for basic life. And then we have two groups of people. People who are super filthy rich in those developing countries, and people who are super filthy poor, right? What Pierre has been telling you, okay, not filthy, that's a very wrong word, apologies. But what Pierre tells you actually in this particular debate, right, is that what this does is that it deepens the classism that exists in developing countries. How does it do so? Because at the end of the day, these entities will largely be afforded by people who are rich, and people who are poor won't afford much of it, right? Which is what I'm going to be showing you in this constructive. But besides what other peers say, let us actually deconstruct this case, right? Firstly, they tell us that government will subsidize and pay on people's behalf. Firstly, if these governments are really corrupt according to their characterization, how does this happen? They don't tell us. But also what we think is that majority of the people in these countries is really poor, right? That means if the government can really afford to pay for these people, why can't then the government afford to run these entities in of itself, right? I think that's another clash within the case. Second thing that they tell us is that government has no interest towards improving these entities because government is not for profit. We really don't buy that, right? We think that in developing countries, governments are beholden to the people, firstly, but even if that wasn't the case in most instances, we think that efficiency is a very powerful political tool, right? Even if you look at the South African context, the reason why the DA and the EFF are coming after ANC is simply management, right? In the municipalities that the DA has already won already, they're trying to establish their brand and their mark by making things as affordable for people, as available for people, because it's a very powerful political tool. We think that even we can consider governments are not beholden to the people in terms of profit, but at least we think that they are beholden to the people because things like efficiency are a very huge talking point in terms of politics in these countries that helps the governments to be efficient. On competition and fair pricing, right? Firstly, we think that these utilities that are the most basic function perfectly in monopolistic forms. Things like power provision and water provision. That's why you can't have thousands of independent providers establishing their own power stations each and everywhere, right? For you to have this kind of fair pricing. So at the end of the day, if you're going to privatize those things on which people's lives depend on, then you give it to one company that has to manage all the power in the country, or at least two companies, right? I don't think that kind of competition is very significant enough to lower the prices for someone who earns something like 5,000 rands per month for them to live their life. That doesn't happen on your side, right? But also what we get this pure eye from closing opposition, that there is large capital flowing into developing countries so we can set up these systems. Firstly, what they have to understand is that this money is not money that's just floating in the air that we can just grab and channel into certain things for us to use, right? We think that this is money that comes in with terms and conditions and is very directed to things such as mining that are really profitable. What it means then is that if you want to be a private sector that improves these conditions, you have to bring your own money. And as you bring your own money, you refer back to what YPSP spent at the best speech in this debate, right? When you bring your own money to revive the water reticulation system of Zimbabwe, as someone who's beholden to profit, every cent that you spend to make this water work is a cent that has to come back with 2 or more cents in profit. What that specifically means for the poorest person is that that person most likely won't be able to each and every time afford that water, but then you force them to also look to other alternatives which might not really be safe, and we think that that is very bad. Not now, Tiam, right? Not now, Tiam. So we think that that actually doesn't work. But also what is very important in this debate is for us to realize that when we privatize these things, these companies are very much beholden to profit. So what happens is they then end up providing for the people who can only pay for them, right? So what we tell you is that when you privatize, you bring in a capitalistic nature, and a capitalistic nature really isn't like a giveaway, or really doesn't care for so much as things like the basic human rights or people. That's why things like exploitation happening. What happens at this point is that you get these private companies prioritizing the people who can afford these services. And the people who can afford these services really well. Why? Because they're a very select few, and they're a very rich few, as in developing countries. So at the end of the day, what you have, Madam Speaker, is that you have these private companies making sure that the clientele is satisfied. And who is the clientele? The clientele is the person that actually affords these things, who is the minority and who is very rich. So what we don't have from them is why a company really has a lot of incentives to actually do these things specifically for the poor. But then I think it's only justified. Tell me, should.
You can.
Speaker, isn't it true that the class divide is even greater when you have inefficient public services and really well-run private transport services in your case of the debate?
We'd rather have an inefficient bus that gets you to work than you walking to work, right? Which is what we've been telling you. You won't even be able to get on that bus that is even insufficient. So what we furthermore believe, Mr. Speaker, from our side is that another inconsistency in their case is that they tell us that there's already infrastructure, and that what this infrastructure really lacks is proper management, which is a very huge wow. Considering, like Francois' first statements, when they tell us that these countries literally have nothing, they can't provide for these services. So it's either these countries really don't have anything as you propose, or they already have infrastructure, you just want to change the management, right? We think that under our side of the house, you can change management by giving you, like, making a new government, voting for new governments that will better manage these things. I think it's only fair from opening opposition to make a comparative after identifying why they can. Why can we? Governments are beholden to the people. There's a direct mandate, therefore they have more incentive to take care of the poor. But even if they don't, we think that the issue of how provision of service and efficiency is a very strong political tool in these areas. Governments will end up providing for these people. I've never been more proud to oppose. Thank you.
We thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for their speech. Now to begin the closing half of this debate, invite the Member of Parliament.
Speaker, note that developing nations are faced with a choice when they are beginning to develop. They can either pursue a path of state ownership for the entirety of their economy, or pursue a path of privatization and a free market. We will explain with our extension as to why this decision to privatize our enterprises within a nation will result in a greater likelihood of free market development and a greater chance for economic growth on net. But before that, let's get into a few points of extraneous rebuttal. The first, I want to highlight a concession that its OO makes. They say that these governments within these developing nations are inherently corrupt. The biggest problem with this is that this means that they would be terrible entities at running enterprises. Obviously, a corrupt nation does a pretty bad job of running entities such as lights or trains. That is brought up pretty clearly by OG. But the problem here is if the goal of this round is to create good enterprises, then opposition side will not provide you that benefit because the government is fundamentally corrupt, at least by their concession. Alright, the second argument they go for is this price gouging argument. OG gives a lot of analysis as to why the government will intervene and stop this analysis from happening. But the problem is that we give you 3 different reasons as to why, even if the government doesn't intervene, price gouging will not be a thing. The first is that price gouging only works if people can afford to pay higher prices. In developing nations, most individuals have low income compared to Western areas. Of course, they have greater strains on their budget. For example, spending more on food or spending more on gas. As a result of this, corporations will not be able to actually price gouge because no one's going to pay for their prices if they raise them, and the corporation will go out of business. Secondly, and more importantly, we believe that competition just solves this problem on net. OO gives us analysis that there's a small number of companies, and therefore competition doesn't work. But the problem here is that you only need 2 corporations to actually have a type of competition, right? They just need to talk to interact with each other, and therefore raise lower prices on that. As a result, this would result in lower prices on that because these individuals are not private monopolies. These corporations will not have complete control of the market as a state would. And here's the third response. State-owned monopolies face no backlash from rising prices because the government can never go out of business. Even a private monopoly, let's say that we take the worst case scenario that becomes a private monopoly. Private monopolies can at least go out of business if no one buys their product. And a new corporation can actually replace them. However, if a state is raising their prices, there's no reason for them to ever leave, and therefore those prices would remain forever. The third analysis they make is that these corporations are these entities are fundamentally natural monopolies, and therefore the government is the only one that can actually solve for these issues. But the problem is they don't actually engage in RPOI that we say in their speech. When we tell you that these developing nations have a vast amount of foreign investment flowing into them, right? The problem is that the reason why this is the case, in the vast majority of cases, this is a new market for individuals to enter in, and therefore they're going to do so. Especially when a government gives a domestic firm a bid to create that type of investment. Therefore, that creates the channel they ask for, right? When you have a opportunity for a corporation to actually create transportation systems, that's going to entice actual investment. The final thing they talk about is how corporations are always beholden to profit, and therefore will always look at the elite and the powerful and only cater to them. But the problem is that this will happen regardless of either side you vote for because of the political incentives that exist on their side of the house. In developing nations, because their governments are so corrupt, as Owen likes to discuss, the elite and the powerful control where things are placed. And as a result, transportation systems and enterprises are going to be focused in wealthier areas and are going to be largely ignoring poor individuals just because of how these governments are set up in the OO characterization. So even if that is not the case, though, private organizations are going to be less likely to be beholden to these types of incentives because money is the same no matter which individual actually supplies it, whether it be a poor person or a rich person. So therefore, there's less likely to have that direct type of discrimination, and more likely to be occurring on side. All right, now let's move to the greater extension. We'll provide you 3 reasons as to why this type of policy results in greater economic development. The biggest fundamental thing here is that on either side of the house, governments have the incentive to make these enterprises work, right? On their side of the house, it's for actually investing in them. But on our side of the house, it's freeing up free market potential so private organizations can thrive when they make these types of things. The first argument we'd like to discuss here is that these countries will result in greater free market protection. So, for example, the protection of private property or good contract law between corporations, so these private businesses can actually succeed. The reason why these governments have the incentive to do this is because they want these transportation systems to actually thrive. The second reason is that when investors see these private industries thriving in these countries as a result of governments making these private industries work, they're more likely to actually invest in these nations because they can see the private industry is working in that nation. And as a result, more corporations are going to enter the market, which results in greater growth on net. But the third and most important thing is it allows the government to lessen the tax burden on themselves, as in they don't have to pay for these enterprises, they can allow other entities to do this. This results in 2 possible outcomes. First, the government decides to cut taxes, in which there's more business opportunities because businesses have to pay less taxes in those developing nations. But the second outcome is that the government decides to not cut taxes. And if they decide to not cut taxes, they can supply more money to people who actually need it and don't have to spend that money on these certain outcomes. On that, the government has more money to throw around and create better outcomes, which is probably important. Before I get into the impacts, I will take opening.
All good and well, but what's going to happen to the people in areas that are fundamentally unprofitable? For example, rural, dry communities that need water.
We believe that when a nation grows economically in total, they can supply that type of economic growth to these areas via methods of redistribution. That pretty much solves when a nation gets richer, it can help its less well off. This happens empirically throughout the entire world. All right, now let's go into the impacts. The first is that private firms are going to enter the market as a result of increased protections in these nations, which results in greater economic growth, which further results in a greater quality of life for these individuals. Furthermore, it results in a greater middle class as a result of economic growth, and therefore there's greater democratic processes as individuals fight for greater rights, which is probably pretty important. The second thing is that more private firms means greater market market conditions in the future, as it creates a snowball effect where these corporations can lobby the government for more free market regulations, which means more a spillover effect to other industries. So there's privatization not only just in enterprises but throughout the entirety of the economy. But the third thing and the most important thing is it doesn't matter if the state is a better actor on net for these enterprises because of the greater effects across the entire economy by making the nation richer. If you make a nation richer, if you make each individual person in your nation have a greater ability to pay for these things, you lift individuals out of poverty, which is overall a net benefit, which means 2 things. one, the government has a greater tax base and therefore can provide to greater people, but secondly, it limits that corruption that OO likes to talk about because these individuals have a greater incentive to fight for actual rights because they're no longer starving and they're no longer having to fight every day to make a living. On that note, this small step to privatize these enterprises sends a signal to investors in the entire world that your nation is ready for economic growth and your people are ready to succeed. Thank you.
We thank the member of government for their speech and now invite the member of opposition. Hurry up.
What has largely been missing in this particular debate is the characterization of what state-owned enterprises specifically look like. State-owned enterprises tend to be things that the government previously controlled, such as energy, infrastructure, resource exploitation, right, or resource mining. The particular characterization here is particularly important in understanding all the arguments that are coming out from government bench. So before moving into refutation, and you will see how this characterization oftentimes comes into play. First, in terms of what opening government comes. Opening government hinges their case on the fact that privatized organizations will lower prices, and they give you two reasons. Governments will regulate, and competition will regulate, right? First, on governments will regulate. They characterize these governments as developing countries that are rife with corruption. In that particular instance, aren't those officials of those governments susceptible to bribes, which would deregulate these specific industries, right? They're susceptible to kickbacks, which specifically allows these corporations, privatized organizations, to run amok and do whatever they want. No meaningful regulation will come. Then they talk about how competition will regulate, and they cite U.S. telecommunications, which is just a very ironic example, because the U.S. telecommunications market is a oligopoly of 5 different companies that have a monopoly that is protected by the government, where they literally charge you $200, $300 to use Wi-Fi or to make phone calls, right? On the comparative, if you look at Korea, which has a government-owned telecommunications service, the entire country has Wi-Fi, the entire country has reception, and it's completely free. So this is indicative of the fact that privatized organizations don't necessarily create better regulation. So then we move into the back half where we hear this argument on price gouging, specifically the unique mechanism they introduced on how it still has to be affordable in order for it to be a meaningful business, right? Understand, if you have utilities such as electricity or water, you don't get to choose who exactly you're buying from, right? You have one water company, and if the water company chooses to charge you 50% of all the income that you have, you don't have a choice as to whether or not you want to change your supplier, right? Because that simply doesn't happen. Oftentimes these utilities companies are protected monopolies. So even if they charge you 50%, you won't be able to do anything about it, and price gouging could still occur. Then we hear this idea on the greatest economic development occurs when you privatize state-owned corporations, right? This is just ridiculous. If you look at the examples of successful state-owned enterprises such as Singapore or China, you'll see how massive government intervention oftentimes creates economic development in those particular instances. This is a counterexample to their argument. This takes us into my first constructive point, and this is the unique extension that we are bringing, one of two. The privatization of state-owned enterprises creates a wealthy ruling class which generally radicalizes the impoverished. Historically, when a public commodity is turned over to private corporations, it creates a de facto oligopoly, right? Or de facto ruling class. That means the means of productions are held by a few people. The oligarchs in those particular instances form an in-group connected by a thread of wealth. This collective group forms an entity that uses their privatized structures to leverage the government to fulfill their agenda. This is a critical piece of analysis that is important to understand how Russian oligarchs oftentimes are able to leverage the Kremlin or leverage other people in the Russian government into doing things, right? The fulfillment of one group's demands by virtue of political capital and economic capital prevents the fulfillment of another's, right? So this is the cost benefit that exists within politics. Structural issues such as the infrastructure or income redistribution that are specific to the working class will be exacerbated and ignored. The aggravation of this, not this moment, this type of aggravation generalizes the radicalization of the public, which will be responded to by further suppression by the ruling class. Because the ruling class sees some form of radicalization, some form of protest, they'll be forced to use further oppression, further types of protest mitigation that is oftentimes incredibly damaging to the working class. This action causes further extremism, oftentimes leading to revolution, right? So how does this exactly look in practice or in the real world, right? During the period of time when China went from an imperial monarchy to a republic, the resource enterprises were privatized. Understand that those resources were previously owned by the emperor. But when they decided to move to a republic structure, that meant individuals were able to own these mineral resources or state-owned enterprises, right? The Chinese Republic was then mired and bogged down by new wealthy ruling class. The wealthy class, wanting to protect their wealth, passed ridiculous labor laws that specifically made labor untenuous for millions and millions of people across the country. This radicalized the workforce, causing a communist revolution where the revolution, maybe you've heard of him, Mao Zedong, caused the death of 15 million people by political purges and famine. Another good example is emblematic of this linked story is when Russia went from the USSR to the Republic of Russia, where resource enterprises were privatized. The USSR only had state-owned enterprises, but the transition into capitalism created monopolistic oligopolies. Labor conditions had become increasingly poor, where minimum wage and worker conditions are increasingly atrocious, right? This is indicative of the fact that these conditions then incited protests, where Putin's current political rankings have never been lower, where there have been the largest democratic protests in the world, largely due to these conditions, right? The radicalization of the people occurs when you make that transition. A key piece of analysis that occurs is that the transition to public to private is incredibly tenuous. There's uncertainty in those circumstances, which causes the political climate to cause radicalization. I'll take front half.
Entire revolutions come and nations fail because of privatization?
Is that really going to be your POI? Because I just explained the link story. Yes. All right. Moving into our last argument, which is specifically about how state-owned enterprises are necessary for the stability of a developing countries. Note the nature of state-owned enterprises, which I specifically characterized to you at the very beginning of my speech. It is based on public commodities such as energy or infrastructure, such as coal mining or roads, right? All these enterprises are necessary for the fulfillment and functionality of a nation. Developing countries are often young governments, as characterized by opening government. Young governments have less legitimacy, which means that they are often susceptible to either a coup or either some form of revolution. These state-owned enterprises are often able to be used to leverage against those revolutions. A very good example would specifically be Hong Kong, when there were massive democratic protests, but due to the fact that state-owned enterprises ensured that those roads were privatized, they were able to maintain some form of consistency within government and the prevention of some sort of democratic coup. So understand that the two primary arguments we're bringing to you is one on how the privatization of state-owned enterprises creates a radicalization of people, which one either creates protest or two creates actual revolution, or second, where state-owned enterprises can be useful in leveraging against coups or leveraging against instability. Once again, do not pass this motion. Very happy to oppose.
We thank the members of the opposition for their speech, and now invite the government to conclude the case of government segment together.
Opening half of this debate, and to my dismay, closing opposition as well, was an interesting back and forth about whether or not developing countries in the present time are too corrupt, or if their people are too poor to undergo the kind of change that we are proposing on side government. We are the only team in this round to present to you an analysis of what it is that developing countries ought to do in order to achieve their primary goal in virtue of the definition of the fact that they are developing countries, which is to develop economically and politically in the long term. It is true that developing countries often have weak economies and weak institutions. The way to fix that is to undertake policies that will fix those things in the long term, rather than debating about whether or not it will be immediately good in the short term, although that is relevant as well. So 2 things in this speech I want to talk about. First, I want to talk about long-term development. Secondly, I'm going to talk about short-term efficacy, with rebuttal interwoven to the extension from the closing opposition. So first, on long-term development. The first thing I want to say here is that the last speaker said literally nothing about our extension on long-term development within economies and the within developing countries, both politically and economically, and how this invites and the analysis that we gave you on this. That means that you have literally nothing to vote on with regard to what they responded to our extension with, which means that it stands in this round at this point. So what did we tell you? We told you that supporting privatizing these, these kinds of enterprises shows you that shows to investors around the world whose capital you need in order to begin to develop your economy, assuming that you are a developing country that is potentially low on natural resources or the initial ability to generate a lot of economic capital within your country. You need the money from outside other parts of the world in order to start developing your economy. When you support privatization, that means that you send both a message that you are willing to bring in foreign investment and other types of investment from wealthy actors, perhaps within your country as well. It goes both ways, but also that when you see these companies succeed and be profitable over time, you invite people to invest both in them and also in other corporations and businesses that exist within your country. You invite tourism and all these sorts of things that develop your economy in different ways and make it more likely, no thank you, and make it more likely for you to have a stable country in the long term. We tell you that this is likely to perpetuate and stay profitable over the long term because countries that don't have these type of systems do fail, which is where the type of safeguards that we hear from opening government is especially important, at the point that they tell you that it is true that countries are still expected to provide these services or make sure that they exist to a large extent, which is to say that if these corporations were to completely fail, then we think that there is some extent to which the government would subsidize them and make sure that they continue existing for the people who need them inside your country in order to prevent something like a horrible political unrest and this sort of thing. We give you this analysis, it goes unresponded to, but we also tell you the benefits that these countries can reap from doing this, which is to say that if you choose to cut taxes on your people, then those people now have more economic capital in their own pockets so that they can self-determine, which is a major impact in this round. But if you don't choose to cut taxes and you choose to retain the amount of money that you have in your government, then you can continue to build the institutions that you have in your country in other ways without having to spend massive amounts of money on running state-owned corporations. There's really a huge influx of capital that comes into your government from doing this. This means you can do things like build a welfare state, or protect people in their retirement, or have things like healthcare, which you can't already have because you're spending so much money on these corporations. These are the kind of long-term trade-offs that we would prefer. There's the kind of things that get ignored completely by closing opposition. We tell you that they can fix things in the long term as well. We tell you that when corruption exists in your country, you can solve that, or rather that it gets solved by raising up the poorest people in your country to a point where they can spend their time being politically active rather than just trying to survive, and you can reduce the corruption that you have in your country through political pressure. We think this is especially important. So the extension that we get from closing government is twofold. First, they tell us that you will have this wealthy elite class arise that will then lead to the exploitation of the poor, to lead to political unrest and political coups. Other than being a lot of rather large jumps to the worst possible impacts, this extension relies on some kind of uniqueness to their side of the house. It's the case, as OO pointed out during their speeches, that there is often a huge divide between a ruling class and everybody else within a developing country, with no substantial middle class in the middle. That means that there's always going to be, in the status quo, to some extent, a ruling class within that society. At that point, it's massively unclear to me why any of the impacts that they claim from this are true on their side of the house uniquely, or on our side of the house uniquely, as opposed to those. I just don't think they did the work to show that, even if it is there in the argument. The second thing that they talk about is that, all right, let's move on. So the next thing to talk about, you know what, sure, go ahead, opening.
Sure, this is where your case falls out, right? Why is long-term development a factor when we're talking about things that have characterized as provisions on which the basic lives of these people rest on, such as water, electricity? Why long-term? Why not now?
Okay, so I'm about to explain this. I don't think these things go away in the short term for reasons that we've told you up and down government bench. For instance, we get the response from opening opposition that you have to, for example, build infrastructure in order to do this, which creates a barrier to entry, which means that these services won't reach certain parts of these countries. I think in the status quo, where these things are already reaching people, that infrastructure already exists, which means all you have to do is then profitize it in order to bring that, which means that insofar as a certain amount of people are getting water or getting electricity in the status quo, it's always going to be at least the same, if not better, on our side of the house. I don't think large numbers of people lose their access to electricity or water or power because you can still use existing infrastructure to provide those services if you are a profit-seeking country, which you want to do because you're trying to make as much money as possible, and you can just sell it for lower prices in those areas. I don't think it's reasonable. I don't think it is the case that people do lose this. But the second thing that we get as a concern from opening opposition is that they say that developing countries' populations are split between the very rich and the very poor, which means that price gouging is extremely unlikely to happen under a concession that they make themselves, which is to say that if you are a company providing this service, then you must have to provide this service to a profitable extent. If there are a very small number of people living in a few enclaves who are extremely wealthy within your country, which probably is the case, that means the vast majority of the people who would be using these services are people who don't have as much wealth, which means you can't gouge those prices. It means you have to provide it at a rate that will be accessible to them in order to stay competitive regardless. You just have to start at a point where you can provide this service. Maybe the prices will go up as the country develops and everyone gets richer, but that's probably fine. We also get this concern about whether or not these companies will self-regulate. Look, I think as a government, as I said, there is still a burden on you to provide basic structures. The problem in this round is that nobody talks about long-term development other than us. They should have responded to it, but they didn't. Extremely proud to propose.
We thank the Craftsman Group for their speech. Now invite the opposition to gather up.
Closing government fails to engage with our extension because they think it is wacky. I disagree. They fail to engage, but they do not give you the reason why our link story that Brian provided to you is false, and therefore it still stands in the round. That is the critical error that they make. So let's address them. Let's engage with them like they did not engage with us. So first of all, the thing they say is basically that, it will cause economic development. This will somehow lead governments to help their own people. Recognize that they already conceded to our opening when they said the governments are corrupt. Recognize that in the world today, when governments are corrupt, when they amass wealth, that gap becomes not just a socioeconomic gap, but also a political gap, a gap between the ruling class, not just the people with money, but the ruling class of people who control the policy, control the government, trying to still accumulate wealth, while the poorest of the poor still remain poor. Governments do not help their people necessarily. Right, we see this in India, right? Perhaps, right, when we go and we see that the roads are not exactly are not yet paved in certain places. The majority of, maybe not majority, but a large swath of the Indian country, right? The countryside, the rural areas do not have access to internet, perhaps don't necessarily have clean water in certain places. The only thing I know for sure is the internet thing, but we're gonna keep going. Okay, cool. So the government does not necessarily help when it is rich. In fact, it accumulates money. So then there's this interesting, here's the clash then, is they say that somehow economic development will happen and nobody engages with them and they actually create economic development. Look, it's probably a bit of a clusterfuck whether or not economic development happens in either case. In either case, it's either fucked or not fucked, right? And we have no real warrants to understand whether or not it's actually going to develop, but you do know one thing, is that there are two classes of people. There are the poor who are not able to access the resources they need to subsist, and you have the rich who access that completely. Now there's this interesting interaction in the front half of the debate where the main question that they're asking is, are the prices going to be high and low? Our opening team hinges their case on accessing the fact that the prices are going to be high, therefore none of the lower class is going to be able to, afford any of those things, and they rely, the opening government relies on the prices being low such that everyone is able to afford it. Look, we have no idea whether or not the prices are going to be low or going to be high. Their model wasn't specific enough to tell us exactly how or exactly why. They didn't warrant this out for you. It's different everywhere, and the world is a very diverse place. Look, we have no idea how that's going to play out because they didn't model it for us, which is their largest failure in the opening government. Now look, at the end of the day, what you have to recognize is something that is inherently true. The people who buy the utilities from the government, when the government decides, I'm going to sell these utilities, are probably going to be rich people because they can actually afford it. What does this mean? This means that regardless of whether or not the price is high or the price is low, they are going to accumulate wealth. If the price is high, it's probably a lot worse for all people. If the price is low, it's probably marginally better for some people, but recognize that people who are accumulating wealth rapidly are still going to be the Li Ka-shings of the world who own roads and highways and tunnels in the city of Hong Kong of 7 million. Brian gives you this really great example of democratic protests that arise in Hong Kong as a direct result of income inequality, not necessarily democracy. Ignore like the American press. As a Hong Kong person, it's really about income inequality, because when people can't afford to eat, people can't afford to pay rent. They revolt. How do we know this is true? Now, Brian gives you a second example about how privatization specifically leads to revolution. An example of this is the Cultural Revolution in China, in which 15 million individuals were killed by, famine and a lot of really shitty things that happened. Right? Recognize this is a direct result of privatization that failed. We don't know whether or not this specific privatization is going to fail or succeed, but we think that the calculus of risk that you have to undertake when you adjudicate panel is the following. It is, do I want to risk millions of people dying when we access our impacts of revolution, or do we want to invest in our own country ourselves? I'll take over.
Can you maybe deal with our point on how the debt that these companies currently bear make governments as a general unattractive investments?
Okay, cool. So in terms of unattractive investment, look, earlier we had a POI about Chinese corporations, Chinese government corporations. Recognize that those corporations, although our corporations are still owned by the state has a massive share, and therefore we think that those corporations are still technically owned by the state, because if the state owns the shares, they own the company, right? So think about that, right? When we look at that, let's engage directly with their POI. So they talk about how, foreign direct investment. Recognize that in the world today, a ton of people invest in Chinese oil. Chinese oil is a government-run company that is still a government-owned entity. Right? Recognize that when they are able to do that, when they have huge amounts of foreign direct investment, they're able to have the benefits that we see on that they're trying to propose on their side of the house. Now, what else is interesting about that in particular is kind of the following. If you want your country to be more investable, why don't you run your country more like a company, not privatize? Now, understand the delineation here that Brian tells you basically exists, right? The delineation, right, between you selling off the things that you have, the things that you've been holding for a very, very long time, to literally the most corrupt of the corrupt, the richest of the rich, who have for years and centuries accumulated people on the plunder of other people, right? It is incredibly important to note that at least the government still kind of owns the company. That's really, really important. Or no, at least the government still owns the thing, even if they're running more like a company. Will this mean that things get slightly more corrupt? Yeah, sure, maybe, but it is not the thing that is going to lead directly to revolution. Yes?
Wealthy elite exists on either side of the house. On the op bench, they have the political elite who have no accountability. Wouldn't you rather the elite be subject to the bare minimum of free market accountability?
Perhaps. But recognize why the monopoly that exists on your side of the house and the monopoly that exists on our side of the house is effectively undistinguishable. Brian tells you this. Why does Brian tell you this? Brian literally says that when these companies have no means of sorry, let's just backtrack because I did have this structured, I promise. Okay, cool. There is a sheet here somewhere that has that rebuttal. Private sector, okay, wait, no. Yeah, OG and I guess CG now says the private sector is better because of competitiveness. We say other companies can't compete. Why? Because A, there are huge upfront costs to entering the market, and B, the reason why there is no competition is because you probably only have one need for an electric utility company. Not only that, but in America, let's say we shift to telecoms, Brian tells you that in America, 5 companies own all of the telecom companies. This has 2 impacts. First is that the prices are really high, which isn't really that important, but then additionally, that it's still basically a monopoly where people are getting screwed over and these companies amass huge amounts of power. What's important in this debate is the fact that the people who own these companies still own the means of production, and the means of production ought to be held by the government, and that is incredibly important, right? Recognize that the most important thing in this debate, in terms of weighing, in terms of what you ought to do, is whether or not it is whether or not that risk is something that you want to take. We have have no idea whether or not the hypothetical country they created is going to be stable enough to undergo the process of privatization that has killed millions of people in China when they first privatized. Recognize that the China that existed then is the same country that it seems that OG has set up now, and revolution in this specific instance, under their model, under their argumentation, does not access. We do not access economic development if everyone is dead. Thank you.